Good afternoon. Welcome to the Generator School Network webinar, State Policies for Service Learning, Opportunities and Obstacles. We're really glad that you could join us here today. I am Karen Pernew, the Program Strategies Director at the National Youth Leadership Council, and I'm here today with Ann Rautio, the Assistant Researcher for the National Center for Learning and Citizenship and the Post-Secondary and Workforce Development Institute. She has participated in researching the first ECS Service Learning Policy Scan and subsequently has served on research teams for arts and education, citizenship education, youth engagement and policy making, international benchmarking, and policymakers in post-secondary developmental education. She edits NCLC's electronic newsletter, Citizenship Matters, and provides a final eye to much of the written work developed by her coworkers. Ann holds a bachelor's degree in English from Colorado State University, and she's here today to talk with us about the new 50-state policy scan on service and service learning. We're going to start out today with some introductions to state policy and institutionalization, what we mean by that. Ann's going to give us an overview of the policy scan and talk about some of the notable policies that they've found and some of their implications. And then we'll talk about next steps. One of the things that I wanted to say about housekeeping here, this is going to be a webinar that's presented largely through the PowerPoint and audio. We won't be able to take live voice questions from the audience, but if you have questions at any time, you can type them into the chat box, and I will read your question and ask Ann what you want to know. So if you have a question, please feel free to type it into the chat box when you're ready. As we begin, Ann, what can you tell us about what is state education policy? What are the pieces that are included in that?
State education policy is legislation. It can be state statutes and state code or regulations. It can also be Board of Education policies. In a kind of an informal way, state departments of education also have policies, but they're not as institutionalized. They're not as firmly in place as statutes and codes and Board of Education policies.
Mm-hmm. And I heard you mention a term there, institutionalized. What is institutionalization, and why is it important when it comes to service learning policy, or other kinds of policies for that matter?
Right, that's right. Well, it's important because it really solidifies the stature of a policy. The definition of institutionalization is to incorporate it into a structured and often highly formalized system. And of course, state legislation is about as formalized a system as you can get. The policies that we looked at were state statutes and code or regulations, and as I said, the State Board of Education policies. And we also looked at policies and procedures that we got from State Departments of Education website. And these State Department of Ed website policies indicate commitment, but really not institutionalization. Commitment really is important, of course, but it can also hang on the whim of someone at the Department of Ed. One superintendent of schools may be very supportive of service learning, and then the next one that comes in may have another priority, and so service learning, the emphasis on it falls away. State policies give it stability. They're not subject, to the kind of the whims and varying interests of one leader or another.
Mm-hmm. And that institutionalization is what you were really interested in doing this policy scan.
That's right. That's why we as I said, we did look at some of the Department of Ed websites, mainly for information on whether service learning is included in state standards and curriculum frameworks. But all of the other information is strictly from state statute or state code and regulation and Board of Education.
Great. And this isn't the first time ECS conducted a 50-state policy scan on the institutionalization of service learning, is it? Didn't you look into that about 10 years ago?
We did. In the year 2000, I became a policy geek and didn't realize that I was until I got into this. To me, it's really fun to do the research, and it's kind of like hide and seek. You just find something skimming along in a policy, and pretty soon, there's this meat, this nugget of information. In the year 2000, we did conduct the first 50-state and the District of Columbia policy scan on service learning, because we really wanted to kind of see where it was as far as institutionalization in the states. And at that time, we didn't do anything on the websites. We only did state statutes and codes and regulations, and then Board of Education policies. But at that time, we also focused just completely on that single term, service learning. We considered community service, but that had such a tie to restitution and the justice system that we decided that we would not keep that in.
Interesting. And what did you find in the first study that you did?
Well, I was fairly new to the service learning field. I worked for the National Center for Learning and Citizenship for about 2 years before that. And I was impressed at the time. There seemed to be a fair amount. We had to kind of dig more deeply. But we found that teachers and principals and district superintendents, that they were beginning to see the merits of service learning. And we found service learning mentioned in 27 state policies out of, 51, when you consider the district. And at that time, almost all the funding for service learning was provided through the Learn and Serve program from the Corporation for National and Community Service.
And what did you do differently this year when you decided to delve into this again?
Well, we decided that we would search more broadly. Instead of just looking for the term service learning, we decided we would also use community service. First, because a lot of states use the term. They either use community service or sometimes community service learning to describe, the same kind of activity that links what's taught in the classroom to service in the community. And again, too, we just found that community service is often tied to a learning experience. What's interesting is that after a few states, after I had done the research on a few states, I decided that we really needed to include the term student service as well, because a lot of times when you search for student service, you get a lot of the social services aspects of education. So you have to kind of weed all of that out.
Right.
But there were enough times when the term student service also came to really, could be included in our definition of service learning or community service.
So it sounds like you did a pretty thorough search this year.
We did. We did.
What were the categories that you looked at?
Well, when we began, we had a pretty good idea of how the information would kind of fall into categories. And so we organized the results. We have is there a statewide high school service requirement? Is there credit toward graduation? These are all statewide things. Is there credit toward graduation for service learning or community service? And it's interesting, many times, instead of having a requirement for service, there will be legislation that allows districts to require a service requirement for graduation. So so that's important too. And we wanted to know if it was included in standards or curriculum frameworks. And then, of course, we wanted to know, as an instructional strategy, is it identified as something to increase student achievement and, at the same time, to increase civic engagement in students?
Mm-hmm.
So the other thing, and I have to say there is not a lot of policy on this one, but we wanted to see if there were policies that have to do with supporting, encouraging, or requiring service learning professional development, either for teachers or for administrators. And there is some, as I say, not a lot, but there is some. We wanted to know also if the states provided funding for service learning or community service programs. And this would be separate from the funding that has been provided by the Corporation for National and Community Service.
Mm-hmm.
Then the last one is that service learning and community service is identified as a means of preparing students for the workplace. And this, again, this was another surprise. After I had done, probably 10 states, I realized that I was getting a fair number of results that had to do with states requiring in their frameworks, their curriculum frameworks,
Mm-hmm.
that they included service learning or community service as a means to prepare students either for the world of work or, giving students academic or technical skills that they can use in the workplace. So that was a big surprise, and then I had to I had to kind of start all over and go back and do those initial states and really look on their websites in the career and technical ed to see if I could find anything there.
Was that something new you found this time around that you didn't see the first time?
Definitely, yes. Yeah, and that was because this information didn't come solely from the websites, from the Department of Education websites in the states, but a lot of it did, when I would search. And of course, we didn't do anything on the Department of Ed websites in the initial, the 2000 scan.
Sure. Paul, one of our participants, has a comment here and a question, and says Wisconsin has extensive work-based learning, and service learning is a part of that model. How was that considered in your study? Did you?
Well, it would be included in the information on this last category that service learning and community service are identified as a means of preparing students for the workplace. The thing that I need to stress, especially on the reviews that I did of state websites, some are really easy to do, some are not as easy. It can be really kind of a maze when you start to really drill down into a State Department of Ed website.
Right.
So these are representative samples, but I would never guarantee that this is, an all-inclusive review of service learning in curriculum standards and frameworks.
Right, right. So if anybody out there knows of something in their state, let the people at NCLC know, and it can be added to the database.
Yes, definitely.
Let's take a look at how you find that database.
Okay.
So this is the Education Commission for the State's National Center for Learning and Citizenship State Policies for Service Learning database, and it is available for free online. That's right.
They've changed the graphic on our website. I had to look at that for a minute. That isn't the one that I saw about an hour ago. There was a little silence there for a minute. If you look, this is the main page for the Education Commission of the States. And on the right-hand side, on the blue bar, you'll see it says Projects and Institutes. And if you click on National Center for Learning and Citizenship. This is the main page of the National Center for Learning and Citizenship. And it explains, has information on what we are and what we do. But for this webinar today, we want to talk about the databases. On the left-hand side, there's the menu bar, and the State Policies for Service Learning database is the first one. So if you just click on that, this takes you to the landing page for all of the reports. You can either get a state profile, you can get all the information, all the categories that we just talked about are listed for each state. So you can get one state report that shows if there are or are not policies in all of those categories for that particular state. Or if you're interested in the actual categories, then you can look to see, for instance, this first report, high school graduation requirement or credit toward graduation. And this will show the results just of that category for all of the 50 states and the district.
Great. So you get a couple of different ways to find the information that you're looking for.
Right. It just depends on what you're looking for. And I do hope that everyone who's listening will take an opportunity to look at their state profile. I feel pretty confident that all of the policies are correct. But as we just talked about, it's there are times when I don't see everything that's on a State Department of Education website, and sometimes those things aren't even always on the website. So if anybody has additional information, we would certainly like to get it.
Terrific. And overall, what's some of the progress and trends that you've been seeing in the analysis this year as you've been looking at each of these state profiles and each of these categories? Can you tell us about some of the things that you've been finding?
Oh, yeah. I was excited this time. In the year 2000, 27 states had legislation around service learning, and now we have 42 states that include service learning or community service in legislation. So I just think that's a tremendous increase, and it really shows how exciting and how important it is, and it's growing.
And that's really interesting in a time when we've been hearing about some of the troubles with service learning and Learn and Serve America, when the prevalence study that came out in 2008 or 2009 talked about how there had been a slight decrease in service learning. Here we're finding that actually it's becoming more institutionalized across a broader range of states.
Yes, and I think that's very interesting. I have a feeling, and this is just my small personal opinion, I just wonder if the research that's done isn't either broad enough and or deep enough. If people take one survey and look at one thing, and then there's another survey that's done on another aspect, but really the two surveys don't talk to each other.
Yep.
But that's just my opinion, of course. Another thing in the new scan that I thought was very encouraging, especially in this era of high-stakes testing, when that's all we hear about is the emphasis on math and reading. I think it's really heartening to note that 18 states tie service learning to student achievement. So, it's not just, service learning is a nice little thing to do. These states say in policy that it really leads to student achievement.
So this is actual language that is in the legislation?
I have an example it's only about 4 sentences long. This is from a Missouri statute. It says, the State Board of Education shall encourage the adoption of service learning programs and projects among school districts. As used in this section, the term service learning programs and projects means a student-centered, research-based method of teaching and learning which engages students of all ages in solving problems and addressing issues in their school or greater community as part of the academic curriculum. As a result, service learning fosters academic achievement, civic engagement, and character development.
That's pretty impressive to have it recognized in that way.
I think it is too. I really do, yeah. Another indication of progress is that 21 states have legislation that articulates that student engagement is affected by students' participation in either service learning or community service activities. 21 states, I mean, that's almost half. And I have a real strong feeling that we need to engage our students more, not only in their learning, but in their communities and in civic activities. So I think this is heartening to see.
Yeah, that is. Some of the other things that you've been finding, can you tell us a little about those?
Well, yeah. 6 states have an elective credit-bearing service learning course, which I think is, that's just, I felt like stars were going off when I read that. I mean, an actual course, it isn't just the service learning pedagogy is used, say, in a science course or in an English language arts. This is a service learning course that is built into, I mean, that then takes, uses the curriculum. But it's credit bearing, and I just think it's really exciting.
Do you know which 6 states those are?
I did have a list of those 6 states, and I don't have that with me anymore.
Well, we can check that out on the database, I'm sure.
Yes, yeah. As far as being in like benchmarks and instructional strategies, it's very interesting. It's all over the map as far as its specific subjects, alternative education, core curriculum subjects, and then, as I said earlier, career and vocational tech and education programs too. But the thing is that you have to remember about, when it's instructional and benchmark, that's really good, but it's not policy.
Right.
I mean, it can be changed, and changed pretty easily. So that's why we at ECS and at the National Center for Learning and Citizenship are so oriented toward policy.
That makes sense. And then you've identified some other trends in the data that you collected over this past year.
As I said, 30 states, I don't think I had this specific number, but 30 states identify service learning as a means for preparing students for the workplace. And as I said, often in the career and technical education courses. In Michigan, there's a Board of Education document called Policies for Affirming Service Learning. And it states, service learning addresses the long-term goals of quality student academic achievement, workforce readiness, safe and secure learning environments, and a strengthened democracy and civil society. So those are the kinds of things that make doing this research worthwhile when you find little nuggets like that.
Yeah, that's incredible.
Yeah, it is. And 18 states award credit toward graduation for service learning or community service. None of these things existed in 2000. Or I probably shouldn't say none of them, but almost none of these were in existence then. So as you said, it's heartening to see that service learning is becoming more recognized at the same time, it tears your heart apart because funding is going away in many cases. But
yeah, and I guess we just have to get creative about different ways of doing service learning in schools.
Yes, I think you're right. Yeah. Another thing that I thought was interesting, 9 states include service learning as a valuable strategy for at-risk students, like for dropout and suicide prevention programs.
I think that's a really interesting trend too, particularly, again, I come back to the CNCS prevalence study that was done a couple of years ago, where they were finding that service learning is often a strategy that gets used with students from higher income schools rather than some of the more disadvantaged schools, and with high school more so than with younger students. But this seems to say that there is a little trend in really looking at that and trying to think of service learning as a strategy for those at-risk schools.
I have wondered if that's possibly because of the focus that America's Promise has been lately on dropout prevention and, what do they call them, dropout factories, I think. And they've made such a real strong push in the states for dropout prevention programs. And I know that service learning is one of the things that they look at.
Right. We have another question here from Paul. Did you find states, local education agencies, or schools use CNCS categories of service, or Department of Ed clusters and pathways to shape their service learning designs? Did you find anything about that within the legislation and the policies that you looked at?
No, I don't think I did. I didn't see anything about that.
That's interesting too, just thinking about how states are thinking about service learning and how they place it within the curriculum.
Yeah.
And Crystal has another question. Are there any studies similar to this one that you know about in regards to service learning in higher education?
I don't know. I haven't heard of anything. I would probably suggest either looking on the Campus Compact website or contacting someone, at the Campus Compact National Office for that. The National Center for Learning and Citizenship here at ECS devotes our attention specifically to pre-K-12 public schools. And so we kind of are sometimes a little tangentially connected to higher ed issues and work, but as far as the main body of our work, we focus mainly on working with state policymakers on the, as I said, pre-K-12.
Campus Compact would be a great resource for that. And
yes.
Crystal says thanks. You talk a little bit about the disturbing trend in the elimination of Learn and Serve funding through CNCS.
Right.
How many states were receiving funding that way?
48 and the District of Columbia, all but 2 received K-12 Learn and Serve funding. The others, I think every state received some sort of funding from the corporation, but what I was looking at was the line item for K-12 and the Learn and Serve funding. There were 48 states plus the district who received funding.
Yeah, and we were working with South Dakota, who had just set up their first state commission in order to in part to be able to take advantage of some of that funding. South Dakota has started to have some, I know that they had passed some new legislation, and we're looking at building a statewide framework and strategy for service learning. So I think it was a very bitter blow that just when they were getting on their feet, the Learn and Serve funding was eliminated.
Yes, yes. Yeah, South Dakota was one of those two. Yeah, it just seems like we took a couple of steps forward and have to go backwards. But I really think maybe I'm a glass half full person, but I think people who believe really strongly in service learning will keep working toward its incorporation in teaching and learning, no matter what. It's just that, as you said, we have to learn, we have to figure out different ways to incorporate it. When we were doing our study, when we started, I thought it was kind of a pro forma question just to check and see if, does a state receive funding from the corporation. And then toward the end, when we were putting all the reports together, that was when funding was very seriously in danger. And I thought, well, maybe I shouldn't even include that particular question in the reports. But then I thought, no, this really is important. It's important for people to know how important that funding was and how much the states really relied on it. We at ECS became interested in this question, actually.
Yeah, I think
we are headquartered in Colorado, and we've done some work with the Colorado Department of Education, and so the CNET rep, the Service Learning Coordinator in Colorado, called a meeting of as many people involved in service learning as she could think of after, when funding was pretty much eliminated, to see what Colorado could do. And so out of that has grown the Colorado Service Learning Council. And let me kind of backstep a minute. Because we got involved in this Colorado effort, we started thinking, wondering what other states are doing now to, now that CNCS funding is gone, how are other states going to cope with this? So we are now preparing, one of our policy analysts is preparing case studies of 5 states. And that'll be published in an issue brief next March. And the 5 states that we selected are Colorado, Florida, Hawaii, Michigan, and Minnesota. So I'll be anxious to see the results of that.
We have one other question that just came in from Bren. How does the board policy regarding service learning translate to state funding for service learning?
Well, it doesn't always, but it can. A state, a board policy could actually direct districts to encourage funding, to help schools and districts to apply for funding. So in a general way, it really isn't, there isn't much of a connection, but the policy could specifically encourage or direct districts to look for funding.
Right, giving them the permission that they need to be able to do this can be a really important piece there.
Yeah.
Great. And you talked a little bit about what's happening in Colorado. Are there other states that are doing some kind of innovative thinking about survival in a post-learn and serve world, the survival of service learning?
Of the 5 states that we've chosen to do our research case studies on, I mentioned Colorado, and a couple of our staff members are on the Colorado Statewide Service Learning Council. I asked the researcher who's doing this for some information, and she noted Michigan. The Michigan Community Service Commission has a blog, and they have been talking about the impact of the Learn and Serve funding loss, but they also have maintained their commitment to the growth of service learning in Michigan. And so they have asked people who respond to their blog to answer questions that they posted. They want to know what the Michigan Service Commission says. What can we do to help you to sustain service learning without the funding? What are crucial elements of the program that we need to sustain? How can we work together to maintain our momentum in the field? That kind of thing. So there is movement in the states. And as I said, I'll be very, very interested to see what the results of the research that we're doing now.
Right. One of the participants in the webinar has a comment again that in Wisconsin, Wisconsin had a service learning consultant at the Department of Public Instruction, and that position has been eliminated. Have you found, this might not have been part of your study, Anne, but have you found much about the elimination of those kinds of coordinating positions at the state education agencies?
Well, it was not part of our study, but I can tell you just from our Colorado experience that was the case in Colorado as well. That position just didn't have funding anymore, and so she was able to, I think she's involved now in dropout prevention programs, which we talked about earlier, so it's kind of a good fit for someone who is interested in service learning too. I have understood now that the CNET organization has reorganized and has a different title, but I know that they are still committed to service learning in the states. But I'm sorry to hear about that position in Wisconsin, because I imagine that I probably know her.
Yeah, Brand says that North Carolina has just established the North Carolina Service Learning Coalition. And she's wondering if there's any advice that you have from your work in Colorado and looking at state policies. Do you have advice that you could offer them in North Carolina as they start working in this coalition?
Actually, I do. And it's kind of the very last thing that I was going to talk about. But we can certainly talk about it now, too, because I really think it could do with repeating. I really think it's important to talk about it with your peers, with your principal, with your district superintendent, with parents, with community partners. The more people who hear the term service learning and then understand what it means and how important it is, the impact that it has on students, I think that it's just like a groundswell. Also, don't forget the power of students. Everybody loves to interact with students. At our meetings, our big annual meetings are mostly, adult policymakers. There are state legislators and district superintendents or state superintendents. And every now and then we're able to bring in some students who do a presentation. And it just enlivens the place. Everybody loves to hear students talk about their work. And I mean, that's what we're here for anyway, and we hardly ever get any interaction with them. So it would be something that you could do, maybe schedule a time that your students can make a presentation. You have to prepare them. You want them to sound really good, so you do a lot of preparation. But they could give a presentation about work that they're doing to the school board or to a service group, like Lions Club or Rotary, maybe even just to other teachers in the school, or maybe to a school assembly. But the more visibility, I think, the better. And when you do those kind of presentations, you ought to invite maybe the community partner that you're working with or one that you want to work with. And another thing is to make the school board your ally. encourage your school board to pass a resolution in favor of service learning. We have a number of policies that we have available, that we've kind of culled with our work with districts over the years. And I don't have them online right now, but I do have them available. So if anybody wanted to get in touch with me, we could certainly, give you a sample of a board policy. I found a really interesting one-pager on the website of the National Service Learning Partnership. It's called Talk It Up, and it's a whole list of topics, with the specific idea of talking it up. This one was about making the school board your ally. It was written by Dr. Sheldon Berman, who is like Mr. Academic Service Learning for a lot of us. And this is a quote from it. He said, to gain their support, this is talking about school boards, to gain their support takes time and persistence. To retain their support requires high-quality service learning projects, which I thought was really a good quote. So if you are looking, if you want to find this list, it's on the National Service Learning Partnership website, and if you just, I searched, so just do a search for Talk It Up, and that's where I found it. Another thing that we can do as teachers or principals or whatever, if you're ever on a committee to revise standards or curriculum, advocate to include service learning as an optional pedagogy. Look at the policy database reports, our policy database, for ideas on how other states have done this. There's a whole report on is service learning included in standards or curriculum frameworks.
Right. And we have another question that's somewhat related to that. One of the participants asks, where can we find studies and statistics that show that service learning can address our state or national curriculum standards effectively, meaning that they can produce the desired test results? You talk about how service learning is mentioned in several state frameworks and curriculum frameworks and standards, but do you know of studies that show that service learning can really help produce the test results that many people are looking for?
There are not as many as I think a lot of us would like. Those research studies are really expensive to produce, and so it's hard to get funding for them. But Shelley Billig at the RMC Research Corporation has done a number of studies, and those again are, I bet that she probably has a number of studies on your website.
Right.
Here.
Yeah, the NYLC website has a list of research studies that look at service learning and what it shows about some of the academic outcomes. And I believe it's listed as a featured resource on our homepage. So if you take a look at www.nylc.org, in the featured resources, traditionally we have kept one of those updated lists of research studies there. If it's not there, I will put it on the GSN in this topic area following the webinar, so it'll be easy for people to find.
Yeah.
You talked a little bit also, Anne, about looking at some of the innovative funding strategies that some states are using. Do you want to talk a little bit about that as well?
Sure. Minnesota has, eligible districts have access to a formula-based youth service program revenue, and I'm not very good at interpreting this kind of legalistic language, and so that's as good as I can come, but I also, I do have the legislation here. I also would encourage you to look on the Minnesota website I mean on the, the report for Minnesota for the specific wording. But it's based on formulas, and in addition, a district can levy the amount raised too. So I think that's probably the most specific funding legislation in the states. There are some other state policies that direct state boards or districts of education, departments of education, to provide assistance in program development and grant applications, and that they have to include service learning or community service. For instance, in Florida, proposals submitted to the Florida Department of Ed under federal entitlement grants and competitive state and federal grants administered through the department. In Illinois, districts can receive money from the state as grants that are subject to appropriation. Now that's, the sticking point, subject to appropriation.
Right.
But it's there. I mean,
it's there as a policy tool.
Available. Yeah. Missouri says that a state board must provide assistance to districts in locating, leveraging, and utilizing alternative financial resources that assist teachers to take part in service learning professional development, which is an unusual one. Georgia.
That is unusual.
They have 4 elective service learning courses, and then Georgia and New York both include service learning and community service activities in their after-school programs. There might be more. I think a lot of states and districts include service learning and community service in their after-school programs, but it's hard to find that because it's not in state policy. And also, that makes it vulnerable because it's not in policy.
And you talked a little bit about several states consider community service components when awarded grants. Are those specifically service learning grants or other kinds of educational grants?
No, Colorado has a dropout prevention grant award that considers community service activities. Arkansas has intervention block grants, and then I think I mentioned before, Missouri has a student suicide prevention grants.
Terrific.
Yeah.
And you talked a little bit about some notable states here, Florida being a particular good model for service learning and state policy. Can you tell us a little bit about what's going on in Florida?
I picked Florida because they have kind of a real breadth of service learning policy. They have 2 service learning credit courses. They're sequential courses, electives in middle school and in high school. Service learning is included in benchmarks and student outcomes. Their legislative language says, the Department of Education shall encourage school districts to initiate, adopt, expand, and institutionalize service learning programs, activities, and policies in kindergarten through grade 12. Which, there's our word. that's
exactly
the exciting thing. Their 9th graders are encouraged to add, they have to have an academic and career plan when they go into high school, and they're encouraged to include either service learning or community service as part of those plans. And Ohio has some, they were notable, I thought, because they have 2 policies on evaluation. Evaluation, kind of the big buzzword these days.
Right.
But it's not, you don't see that very often. People think it's hard to evaluate service learning sometimes. But in Ohio, there are 2. There's an evaluation rubric that's based on guidelines that are developed by the State Department of the State Superintendent for community service education projects. And then evaluation data for dropout prevention and recovery plans. includes service learning and community service. And of course, then their state board establishes qualifications for teaching community service education for high school credit, which again, I tried to look at, see more about that, but sometimes there's just this one little piece of legislation and it leads you to wonder where's it going, but
right, and you leave it to other people to kind of look at the stories behind it.
That's right, yeah. And there are some other interesting things. Georgia has an alternative, they have alternative education performance standards, and they have a service learning rubric with 4 levels of proficiency. And Illinois, they have social and emotional learning standards. They're the only state that have those, and those standards include service learning. And then Hawaii has a half-credit community service course. That course can be repeated as many times as the student wants. They can earn a maximum of 1 credit toward electives. But when I talked to someone to clarify that at their department, they said, yes, a student can take that as many times as they want, but they really need to be careful about making sure that they have enough other electives so that if they're applying for colleges or something, that they fulfill a number of other requirements.
Right.
And then Delaware has a model turnaround option. That's one of their service learning for persistently low achieving schools. Service learning is included in one of those. I think West Virginia has the most interesting policy. They have a school-level Veterans Honors Funeral Assistant Community Service Program in which qualified, capable of playing, of sounding taps, students in grades 6 to 12 can sound taps during military honors funerals.
That is interesting, especially coming from a state like West Virginia where it has such a strong service tradition in the military.
Yes, and that's absolutely the only state that has that, and I thought that was really innovative. Yeah, and then Colorado, Florida, Georgia, New Mexico, Pennsylvania, and South Carolina all include service learning in students' IEP.
And I know that has been a traditionally powerful tool for students in special education and their transition plans. Service learning has been showing some success there. So it's interesting that there's a number of states that have that institutionalized.
Right. Yeah. And then scholarships. Florida has their Bright Future Scholarship Program. And then and you have to have either, they have a component, a requirement that you have to have some kind of community service or service learning. And then community service or service learning also helps in eligibility for the Florida Academic Scholars Award. And Kentucky has the Robert C. Byrd Honors Scholarship Program, and that also includes service learning.
And so you had some recommendations for better policy and how service learning and policy can impact some of the different areas. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. I've mentioned before that policy institutionalizes service learning. We all know and have heard of great teachers that teach great service learning classes. But when that teacher leaves, if they go to another school or retire or whatever, then often that service learning pedagogy goes with them. It is not continued in the school or in the class because the teacher who replaces them may not even know what service learning is. So service learning in policy, if it's in policy, say a district policy even, it can affect hiring you can have a requirement that teachers who come into a school or a district have experience in service learning. And it affects the curriculum. Cross-curricular service learning projects are more possible. Service learning can be more than social studies. And the community partners, that's often a kind of a difficult thing, I think, to cultivate, to make really work well. But relationships with community partners can be strengthened between existing partners and the school. And, a strong service learning program is also more appealing to potential community partners.
I think so too.
Yeah.
We have another question here. Paul asks, how are states measuring the social and/or economic impact of youth involvement in addressing community needs? He says, I think that should be a part of the conversation as we work to convince others of the value of this type of learning. I'm sorry, that was Brenda who asked that. But do you have a sense of how states are measuring that?
I really don't.
It tends, in my experience, it tends to happen more on the school and district level where they look at those measures of the impacts and the outcomes. But I think that that's a good point, that these organizing committees and coalitions can provide some of that structural evaluation support for that.
Yes. Yeah.
And we had one other question here that Paul had asked. He says, given the 8 quality standards for service learning, is it more important to evaluate the delivery of service learning programs according to the standards rather than trying to evaluate program outcomes for participants? What's your take on that, Anne?
Wow.
It might be a little bit outside the area that you've really looked at in terms of policy.
It does. It is outside of.
Yeah. One of the things, I was recently at the Service Learning Research Conference and really talked about the interplay between the quality standards and student outcomes. And again, any study that has really looked at these seriously has found that those 8 quality standards really make a difference in the student outcomes. That if service learning is not done at a level of high quality, you can actually have lower outcomes for students than you might otherwise have. But if it is done at a high level of quality, consistently those academic outcomes and civic and character education outcomes seem to be found. So I think it's, in the studies that have been done, it's really hard to separate those two, between the quality and the student outcomes, and it's hard to say which is more important to measure.
Yeah, that's what I have heard too, is that if it's really high quality service learning, then the outcomes are positive.
Exactly.
But a poorly done service learning class doesn't do much at all.
We talked a little bit about these next steps and what we can do and kind of reiterate them. We've got just another quick minute here left on the webinar. I just want to find out if there are any other questions from the audience as we wrap up here. I think, so Anne, thank you very much for joining us here today. We have the contact information here for the National Center for Learning and Citizenship at ECS. Will there be a report that will come out on the analysis that you've done here?
Yes. I am hoping to be able to finish it by the end of the year. The reason that Paul Bauman's name is there for a contact is because I'm retiring at the end of this month. So I'm working fast and furiously trying to get the report finished before I leave.
Fabulous. I know that NYLC will also want to highlight that report when it comes out. And we really appreciate you giving us a preview of the findings today. That has just been fantastic.
Well, it was fun for me too.
We have a few more comments coming in here. Paul strongly recommends that, I'm sorry, I lost that particular comment. Just a moment. Strongly recommends including service learning within the portfolio of work-based learning offerings. I think that is a really, really good suggestion and something that we can keep in mind here.
Yeah, I agree.
And if you have questions about the Generator School Network or the Generator School Network webinars, please feel free to contact us here at NYLC at gsn@nylc.org. And just so you know, we have a couple more webinars coming up this week and next week. Getting started in service learning will take place tomorrow, Wednesday, at 5 p.m. Central Time. Designing academically rigorous service learning experiences is going to be presented by Dr. Susan Root, NYLC's Research Director, next week, next Tuesday at 3 p.m. Eastern, 2 p.m. Central Time. And we really appreciate you joining us for this presentation today. Thanks for taking time out of your day to really come here and talk about some of the most important policies in service learning right now. And we really appreciate you and taking your time to share them with us. We have a quick evaluation on the state policy webinar. If you could take a few minutes to go through these questions, we'd really appreciate it. It would help us improve our webinars in the future. But thank you very much for coming and joining us today.
Thanks, Karen.